Hi everyone, this first video is for our module on rumors and urban legends, where we are learning to connect a sociological perspective to understanding rumors and urban legends. So to get started, there we go, I would like you to listen and read through this and then pause and write a little bit. So the questions I have for you have to do with Halloween and how you maybe celebrated it as a child, or how you celebrate it now with your own children, or how you observe others celebrating it. And I do realize that not everybody celebrates Halloween, and that's fine. But it is something that is celebrated in the United States. So even if you don't personally celebrate it, think about your observations about how it is celebrated more generally. So how did you celebrate Halloween as a child? And if you did not celebrate Halloween, how did you see others celebrating it? And then very much directly related to the readings, what safety precautions did you or your caregivers take around Halloween, or that you saw encouraged of others? Okay, so this first article about rumors and urban legends is The Razor Blade and the Apple, The Social Construction of Urban Legends by Joel Best and Gerald Horiuchi. This is an oldie but a goodie. I mean, look at that. It came out in 1985. So this one is definitely in the realm of classics in terms of thinking about social problems and moral panics and how urban legends come to be. Oh, and real quick, Joel Best often makes appearances in the news around Halloween. So, 40 some years later, or almost 40 years later, he still gets media inquiries and is on the news around Halloween talking about this research. So the focus of their research was on the widespread belief that anonymous sadists give children dangerous treats on Halloween. So sort of the idea was that strangers, people you didn't know, may give your children dangerous treats on Halloween. Sort of the classic, the poisoned apple, like Snow White, the razor blade in the apple, or drugs in the candy. In some form, the Halloween treats were going to be adulterated in some way. So they did a content analysis of news stories from 1958 to 1983. So for, 25 years or so of news stories looking for reports on Halloween sadism. And they basically confirmed that by the 1970s, this was an urban legend. So Halloween sadism is thought to involve random, vicious, unprovoked attacks against small children. The idea that, the stranger down the street, the neighbor you don't know all that well, is handing out candies that are laced with something harmful to kill children or harm them in some way. And the children, of course, are innocent victims, right? They're children, so the idea that they did nothing wrong, they didn't deserve this, is part of it. By 1984, the researchers argued that Halloween sadism was just taken for granted, that there were, bad apples out there on Halloween trying to do harm to children. However, they argue that it is an urban legend, and for them, they define urban legends as a product of social strain and of the social organization of the response to that strain. So we'll come back to that in a bit. So what they did was a content analysis of newspapers, of 4 daily newspapers from 1959 to 1984. They focused on the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Los Angeles Times, and the Fresno Bee. So with these newspapers, you have, these are major city newspapers. They're going to have lots of coverage. If something is emerging downstream somewhere at a smaller paper, it's often going to get picked up by something like the Associated Press and wind up in lots of newspapers. Likewise, if something happened, in one of these newspapers or is reported in one of these newspapers, it may trickle down to these smaller ones as well, because of how newspapers, fill their pages with things from the Associated Press. There are limitations, of course. Minor incidents, especially if there was no injury, might not be reported at all. So there may not be a police report if there was a minor incident, especially if there was no injuries of note. Nobody went to the hospital. Nobody got tremendously sick. That sort of thing. That any cases that emerged could be filed under a number of offenses. It could be, it was, assault or, mischief or, disorderly conduct or, something along those lines, right? So there could be other offenses that, incidents that we would call Halloween sadism may get classified as something else. And there's no centralized reporting, hence why they looked at newspapers, right? So, the police weren't tracking, incidents of Halloween sadism, right? The FBI is not collecting data on that. So they, had to go about things in somewhat of a roundabout way. So what did they find over this, 25 years or so of newspapers? They found a whopping 76 stories. So you imagine, 25 years of news coverage, 4 papers, two to three of them very much major national kinds of newspapers, and only 76 that had anything to do with alleged incidents of Halloween sadism. And they felt confident that even though they weren't looking at every single newspaper, that they were getting the stories that were actually being reported, because these stories came from 15 states and 2 Canadian provinces. So it wasn't just things that happened in New York or Chicago or LA or Fresno, but stories that were from other parts of the country as well. There were only injuries in 20 of the cases, but there were 2 deaths. So in 1970, one child died from ingesting heroin, which allegedly was from his Halloween candy. However, it was heroin that he found in his uncle's home. So that was, an indirect death caused by a family member. And in 1974, another child died from candy laced with cyanide, but his father had contaminated the candy. So the 2 deaths that had occurred, one was an accidental death indirectly caused by a family member. The other was an intentional death caused by a family member. So both tragic, but they had to do with family members, not strangers, not the neighbor down the street that you just don't know very well, right? Not the neighbor down the street that all the kids are scared of for whatever reason, right? Not the unknown stranger. Had nothing to do with these incidences. So, this wasn't from trick-or-treating, okay? 31 of the 76 incidents occurred between 1969 and 1971. So that's not quite half, but quite a few of the incidents occurred during this 2-year period. Okay, so there was a lot of attention on this topic during that time. And in 1972, as a result, Halloween safety tips began mentioning Halloween sadism and that parents should check their kids' candy. So these Halloween safety lists have been around for a long time. In 1972, they start telling parents they should check their kids' candy. So their conclusions were that there were no reports where an anonymous sadist caused death or a life-threatening injury. Therefore, there's no justification for the claim that Halloween sadism stands as a major threat to U.S. children. That many, if not most, reports of Halloween sadism are of questionable authenticity. 2 cases were identified as hoaxes at the time, and other cases involved undiscovered fraud. Third, the press should not be held responsible for the widespread belief that Halloween sadism poses a serious threat, at least back in 1985 when they published this, or 1984, whatever year it was, right? They could say that then. I don't know if they would still say that today. I'm not entirely sure. I think we would need a new study for that one in particular. But that they argued that the press provided minimal coverage and publicity. And again, back in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, the media was a main source of information for people. What that looks like today is probably going to look different because of how information and news is spread online through social media. So we may end up with a different conclusion related to number 3 compared to what they did if we were to replicate this study today. But they argue that because there was minimal coverage, there was minimal publicity, that knowledge of Halloween sadism apparently spread by word of mouth. It was, one person to another, saying, did you hear, this thing happened to my cousin's neighbor, right? That's how it spread. Okay. They argue that urban legends are contemporary, orally transmitted tales that often depict a clash between modern conditions and some aspect of traditional lifestyle. So this is where the context matters. So they argue that Halloween sadism as an urban legend, because it included two themes that are found in many urban legends, and that is that there's danger to children, and also urban legends related to contaminated food. Okay, so these are two themes that we find time and time again if we look at many different kinds of urban legends. The historical context also matters. So during the 1960s, this is when we saw the identification, basically, of child abuse as a social problem, right? So, my goodness, the very first, I can't remember what decade this was in now, but the very first case where someone was arrested and charged and whatnot for child abuse, they couldn't even use child abuse laws because they didn't exist. They had to use an animal abuse law in order to prosecute the caregivers of the child who was being mistreated. So, into the 1960s, there's a lot of awareness of child abuse. It's starting to grow. People are starting to recognize it as a problem. This idea of Halloween sadism fits right in that, right? These are strangers looking to harm children. So it fits within that context. That fear of crime also grew during the 1960s and 1970s. So people became a lot more fearful of crime during this era. And there was also a rise in mistrust of others during the 1970s, right? So surveys, show this, that people became less trusting of others during the 1970s. And, we might look at this in terms of, there was another sort of, time where we have growth in urbanization. Perhaps there's some more social isolation that is happening, but that these three factors help provide some of that historical context. And they conclude that thus the diffuse collectivity, the infrequency of reported attacks, the absence of convincing evidence, and the lack of interested individuals willing to commit extensive time to the cause, and the difficulty of devising solutions meant that Halloween sadism became the focus of neither collective hysteria nor successful claims making. So therefore, Halloween sadism, while we may hear about it every Halloween, nobody is actively fighting against it, right? There's no foundation, there's no nonprofit that's we have to raise awareness for this problem. We need to raise funds, we need to educate people. There's no sort of concerted collective effort to that extent. But it has retained considerable symbolic power as an expression of social strain. However, they argue Halloween sadism endured as an urban legend. So how does this relate to today? So today we still, of course, have safety tips for parents. You're probably very familiar with these. We also have some safety tips for keeping pets safe at Halloween, and also some related phenomena. So first, the safety tips for parents. So I just did a very quick Google search to see, what kind of tips came up, and the American Red Cross was one of the first ones that came up. So this is legit, right? This isn't just a news magazine article of safety tips. The American Red Cross has a sense of legitimacy that even other resources maybe don't. But their last item is a grown-up should check all goodies before eating. Make sure to remove loose candy, open packages, and remove any choking hazards. Discard any item with brand names that you are not familiar with. Okay, so this still shows up. This is from 2022. So this still shows up in safety advice, that the grown-up should check the goodies, remove loose candy, so nothing that's already been opened by somebody else. No home-baked treats or homemade candy or anything like that. Remove choking hazards. So I suppose that's if your kids are getting candy, plus also fake vampire teeth and plastic snakes and those kinds of things. Because some kids are going to just pull things from the bag so quickly they don't even realize it's not even food that they're putting in their mouth. Then this last one is discard any items with brand names that you are not familiar with, which is interesting to think about, because just what that makes me think of is that it's really prioritizing well-known candy brands, which there's some issues to think about there. It also may encourage people who, maybe are getting candy from folks who are immigrants or from other, ethnic minority communities. They might be putting candy out that is important to their culture, and now you're telling people to throw it away because you're not familiar with it. So there's I don't know, that kind of rubs me the wrong way a little bit. But anyway, let's move on, because it's not just children who are at risk at Halloween, it is also our pets. So this is an article that comes from 2022. It was on, I think this one came from New York Post, but it was also posted at Fox News, so I'm not sure if there are others about pets. But this was one that came up when I was looking for safety tips on Halloween. This one about pets came up. And a couple of things too, or some of the tips that they gave were the dangers are the pets running out of the house. You open the door for the trick-or-treater and the pet just zooms out of the house. Pets eating chocolate. So also dogs could be poisoned by Halloween candy, but it's even unintentional because it's just chocolate. It's not adulterated candy. Pets might mistake decorations for toys and be hazardous. Pets might be scared of trick-or-treaters outside, therefore you shouldn't walk your dog once the trick-or-treaters are out, because that could be scary for your dog. They could get burned by a lit jack-o'-lantern. And also, don't force a pet to wear a costume if they don't want to, because they may act out. Well, all of these are reasonable tips. I'm not sure that Halloween is more concerning than other, time periods either. But I'm wondering, why now? I think that's the bigger question is, we've talked about children, but why now? Why are we also now having concerns about pets and their risks at Halloween? Maybe it's because pets are more fully entrenched as family members compared to the past. Who knows? And then we have related phenomena, and that is fentanyl in children's things. So I think I do this in another video or another recording somewhere. I talk about the whether or not there's going to be fentanyl in the Halloween candy. But there's related phenomena to that. So while we didn't actually find fentanyl in the Halloween candy, what we do know is that related things have happened, right? LAX seized 12,000 suspected fentanyl pills inside candy boxes. Right, so drug smugglers using candy boxes, which candy is, what we give out at Halloween. Therefore, that connection between candy and drugs and their, that Halloween candy being adulterated, that sort of connection is maintained. Another story I found was about authorities in New York City allegedly found 15,000 fentanyl pills, rainbow fentanyl pills. I don't know why it's relevant that they're rainbow. I have no idea. But they were found in a Lego box, and the Lego box would be a child's thing, right? So, both of these are instances where fentanyl is found in things we could say are for children. So we still have that element of, people intentionally or unintentionally causing harm to children is definitely still kind of a part of this related phenomenon. All right, I'm going to stop there, and I will see you in the next video.